Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Kellam. Welcome to this week's edition of Encounter. Yes, it's sweater weather. There are a couple of things that I really enjoy about doing this program. One is the conversations we have. There are two things I don't like about doing this program. One is actually reaching out and calling and inviting guests to be on, because I'm an introvert and I just don't like to make phone calls. The second thing is, how do I introduce the topic of each program so that you're drawn in and want to pay attention and stay with us for the next 27 minutes or so. There's no teleprompter here. I have to make it up as I go along. So I make it up in the car and practice it on the way into the studio. People used to look at me funny, but now that everybody's on their telephones, they just think I'm on the phone. So here's what I came up with for today. This past week, I discovered in reading the paper, which wasn't really a paper, it was online, but it was the local paper's edition online, that it was Transgender Awareness Week. And that got me thinking, because I found in the article these letters, LGBTQ plus. And then I discovered this morning there's an I in there also. So I thought, what does the church do with these letters? And how do we understand what these letters mean and what they stand for, and whether we should be judgmental or welcoming? What would Jesus do? So I've invited someone who's lived these letters, the Reverend Pat Raube from the Union Presbyterian Church. Full disclosure, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you see that I'm the parish associate, which means I'm the retired honorary title. Is that what? Yeah. And then Pat is the pastor of the church in Endicott. So let's delve into these letters and the church's response. And when we say church, we can't focus too tightly, because our viewers and listeners are Presbyterians, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Jewish, Congregationalists, and so on.
That's right.
And even the most liberal denomination has some really conservative churches.
That's right.
And even some more conservative churches have some very liberal denominations. So we can only talk for ourselves.
Yes.
We can't talk for everybody at this point and say this is the church's viewpoint. But as Presbyterians, this is where we are, and I know the Methodists are going through some difficult times in sorting this through. The United Church of Christ has had this in hand for, 15 years or so?
More like 30.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were ahead of all of us.
Yeah. All right, so let's, LGBTQI+.
Okay.
You want to start with the plus?
Sure. One of the things that I mentioned to you earlier today, and that I think is really important to remember, is sometimes people will say, well, we didn't have this around when I was a kid. We didn't have trans people or whatever. And I think the truth is, we have always had people on a broad spectrum with regard to gender and sexuality, but we haven't always had the language for it. And the plus in LGBTQ plus stands for those things for which we don't yet have the language, that are still unfurling, still blossoming, people still coming to other ways of understanding themselves that don't have a letter in that little group of letters.
Yep.
So.
And that plus is still to be discovered or
That's
identified
right.
or defined.
That's right.
In theology, we would make that plus a mystery.
That's right.
That we don't quite have everything in hand, and we are called to explore. And some of us find that rather threatening, because we like things black and white, pretty much straightforward. Others of us are quite excited by mystery.
Yes.
My son is a scientist, and so mystery is something that he enjoys both in his theology, which he has, and in his science. Yeah. So that's the plus.
Right.
So could we talk a little bit about the Q? I mean, I
Yes.
know
Yes.
lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, which I think we used to say transsexual.
That's right, but now the term is trans or transgender.
Yeah. And then the Q is queer.
That's right.
No.
And for a lot of us, when we were younger, when we were growing up, that word was a slur.
Sure it was.
And it didn't mean anything good. It was something that people called other people to mock them or make fun of them or single them out. And now that word has been, I think, reclaimed by younger folks on these spectrums as a good word to define themselves in a way that I think resists labeling. I think you may have a woman who falls in love with other women or is married to another woman who may call herself queer because she doesn't necessarily want just a label, the label of lesbian. So, which by the way is my label.
Yeah,
If we're going to look at all the letters, I mean, I'm happy to talk about my own journey,
Right.
Which, you know, hindsight being 2020, I had inklings of when I was a young adolescent, when I was 12 years old, and really liked a girl on my softball team and followed her around on my bicycle and didn't exactly know why I was following her around. And we were just friends, but also I had a fascination with her. When I was in my 20s, I certainly had been married, and I was committed to my relationship with a man, and yet I came to understand that I had an attraction to women, sometimes deep feelings of love for a woman, which I didn't act on because I was married. And ultimately, later in life, my marriage ended, and I found that I was free to understand who I was more fully, and eventually ended up in a relationship with a woman, a long-term relationship, which is now, I think, well, close to 20 years, but not quite. And by the way, I'm a pastor, so that was complicated for me.
Yes.
I'm a pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA. And I took my ordination vows not intending to break any of them. And then I was in a relationship with a woman, which for a certain period of time had to be secret because there was a chance I could lose my ordination over it. I started working at the church I serve now in 2007. I was their designated pastor, which is a 2-year term, and I decided to wait to see how the relationship with the church was before I disclosed this to them. About 18 months into that call, they were going to be ready to vote on whether to keep me permanently. And I decided that was the right time to tell them. So I sent a letter to my congregation. I sat down with our governing board, which we call a session. I told them that I was in a relationship, and I wanted them to be free to make a choice as to whether I would be their pastor or not. And our governing board responded with incredible love and support. One person, after reading the letter, which I had put on the table in front of everybody, looked up and said, "Oh, thank God, I thought you were going to tell us you were leaving." So I thought, oh, well, that's promising.
Yeah.
And the congregation, similarly, almost to a person, responded with just a lot of love, acceptance, and support. In fact, one of their first concerns was, can we lose you because of this? And that was one of the...
Denominationally.
Because the denomination was not yet approving of LGBTQ people being ordained.
Right.
That happened in 2011. So after I had been with the church for 4 years, the denomination permitted the ordination of LGBTQ people, but did not require it. In other words, congregations and governing bodies such as presbyteries, it's like a diocese, it's a regional group of churches, were permitted the ordination, but were not required to do it. But what they were told that they could not do was make a policy against ordaining LGBTQ people. They had to evaluate people as whole persons. Look at their gifts, look at their talents, look at the sense of call that they brought, and make their decision based on that. So I was fortunate to already be in an accepting, loving church. In 2014, our denomination permitted marriage between same-sex couples. Again, did not require it, but permitted it.
So that if I were a pastor who had a theological or ethical questions about whether this was the right thing to do, I could say no.
That's right.
I could do that without any recrimination from the presbytery or the denomination.
That's right, exactly. And in fact, if you were a pastor who felt fine about that, but your governing board did not, well, they might ask you to not have that wedding in the church. Mm-hmm. So it left people a lot of latitude to act according to their consciences. But it also asked them not to make policies that would forever, I would say, strangle the movement of the Spirit.
Yep.
So
I remember I served a church in Vermont for about 10 years. And Vermont, before there was gay marriage, had civil unions that were allowed. And the question was, should a minister participate in a civil union? And now, again, we're talking about our denomination. We're not talking about a Roman Catholic priest or someone from a different faith community. And so if I were to have said, there were two men who'd been in a long-term relationship, they were well known in the community, one had grown up in the church, people loved them, the church was full of grace, but we also knew that there were some churches in the presbytery that would bring charges against us for violating the church's constitution. So they came to me and said, would you be comfortable doing a civil union for the two of us? And I said, I would. But I'm not sure that I want to bring the session into this mix. And then there had been some battles in the presbytery, so I kind of hedged my bets, I admit. So I said, I'll tell you what, I'll do everything, right up to the vows. And then I called a justice of the peace, who happened to be an elder in our church, and I said, Francis, how would you feel about doing a civil union? Be glad to, he said.
Wonderful.
So he took that piece of the service, and it was a very meaningful thing done in their home. The dad, a Vermont farmer who was at first not comfortable at all with, he was comfortable with their relationship, but not with the civil union bit, the vows. But during the service, he was wiping away a tear because he knew this is what his son wanted, and he didn't think it was necessary, but he now accepted it. So that's part of the journey. You know, I think the church has made these transitions officially and unofficially. So, and you were personally part of that, and the church joined you in that journey. You mentioned their support, and grace is a big part of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, one of the things that Harvey Milk is famous for, of course, he was an activist. He worked for the city of San Francisco, and he was a gay man, and he was ultimately a martyr because of being a gay man. He always said, come out, come out. When you come out, everyone will find out that they already know and possibly love someone who is gay. So he felt that the best hope for people in society was to be open. Now, as we know, not everybody can do that. People can lose jobs. Certainly at that time, people could lose jobs. And people could lose relationships with family members, and that is still happening, sadly. But I am happy to tell you that the families I know that have LGBTQ children are being incredibly welcoming, and I love being a part of their journeys.
That is one of the difficult things, is that some families still have a very difficult time accepting that child, if not kicking the child out. And by child, we could be talking about a 12-year-old or a 32-year-old.
That's right. That's right.
So
the numbers of children who are runaways on the street, very, very high percentage of them are LGBTQ kids who have found that they can't stay safely in their home or aren't wanted in their home. And of course, the level of suicide is very high, especially among the trans population, for the rejection that they experience. However, it's my hope that those things are changing for the better as we come to understand better how people learn to identify who they are. For me, it took growing up. It took being married to a man. It took listening to myself, to my heart, and honestly to God's love and comfort that I experienced through some of the hardest parts of that. It's heartbreaking to me that for some young people that gets very painful very quickly before they maybe have the resources to deal with it. I was an adult. I was able to deal with that, but as a kid, I don't know what that would have been like for me.
Sure. Our guest today is Reverend Pat Raube, who is the pastor at the Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott. And we're talking about these LGBT, I always have to look at it because it doesn't just roll off the tongue.
No, it doesn't.
LGBTQ. And you mentioned that there's an I now, too.
Yes.
What is the letter I?
The latest version of the letters is LGBTQIA+. And the I is for intersex, which is a physical condition that sometimes a baby is born with genitalia that are indeterminate, that it's not really clear. And I think traditionally throughout the years, doctors and parents have decided together how to best raise this child, whether to raise them as a boy or as a girl. Sometimes doctors will even intercede with surgery at that time. There are more intersex people than we realize because a lot of them don't even know because they were raised in with a very clear gender identification. So.
And A?
And A is for asexual, which would be folks who do not necessarily feel sexual attraction for anyone. And there's a lot of trying to destigmatize that for people, to say that you can be a full person in the world without having a sexual partner. That doesn't mean that they don't necessarily, they may have romantic partners, even without having the sexuality be a part of it. There are so many different ways of understanding ourselves, and I think it's actually very beautiful that people don't any longer are starting not to feel confined to squeeze themselves into a rigid category. They're recognizing that people are more complex than that, and that they have some agency over how they live their lives. They don't have to look exactly one way or the other.
We talked earlier about the fact that this is biology, it is chemistry, and to be sure, our image of ourselves in the eyes of God makes this a theological thing as well. And there are still folks who are reading the Bible and saying, the Bible says that homosexuality is a sin. But that word homosexuality, in the English translations of the Bible, that's where we have our concerns and our discussions and our arguments.
Interestingly, that word, homosexual or homosexuality, is a fairly recently coined word. It was coined in the 19th century, and it was intended to convey a predilection for who one was sexually attracted to. So if you have a Bible with that word in it, somewhere in the New Testament letters, I'm guessing, that's not a good translation because the Greek words behind that are a little less clear. Some of them describe relationships, actions between adults and children, which of course none of us would say is okay. None of us would have. That's not anywhere in that spectrum of letters. That is a power inequality that is never okay, and it's abusive. But the scriptures are not as crystal clear once you take that word out, which doesn't belong there because it didn't exist when those scriptures were being written.
The word was coined about 1,800 years after the scriptures were written.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And if you're a Christian, one of the issues that comes up is, well, what did Jesus have to say on the subject? Nothing that we can determine directly. Jesus does talk about, he says some harsh words about divorce, for example, which he assumes is between a man and a woman because, of course, those are the only people who could be married at that time. But he doesn't really address this directly, which if he had strong feelings on it, you'd think he might have.
Yeah, yeah. I was listening to Dr. Radio this past week, and my car doesn't run without the radio on, and so I was tuning around, and on Sirius XM there's Dr. Radio, and a mother had called in that her 13-year-old daughter had confided in her pediatrician, had come out to her pediatrician, and so the parents, I think this is not new knowledge to them. I think the daughter had already come out to her parents. They were glad that the pediatrician had a relationship with the daughter that was open and that the daughter could share. They were concerned, though, that the pediatrician, somehow the daughter's revelation had made it into her medical record. And so the two doctors on the radio program who had taken this call were chagrined, to say the least. One of them went, oh, as if, why are we even talking about this? Because they were treating her homosexuality as a condition,
right,
as a medical condition.
Right.
And these two doctors were saying, this is pretty old-fashioned science here.
Yes, yes.
So, and this is a 13-year-old girl.
Right, right.
The story in the paper I read, advocates say protecting access for minors is vital in terms of trans youth, for example. This begins with an 8-year-old kid being bullied. So our compassion and our grace, which are at the heart, I think, of what they transcend the theology of the Christian faith based on the teachings of Jesus.
Yes, well, and Jesus's final word on the most important commandments are to love God with all our heart and soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourself. And what does that mean, to love the neighbor? To love the neighbor means to accept them and hopefully to affirm who they are, who they share with you that they are. But we do have, especially for trans youth, I think, they are coming under target in a lot of places. And there is a lot of misinformation that's out there about the kind of care that a young trans person might get. And in all things, their parents are trying to be compassionate, their parents are trying to be supportive, and they're trying to give their child the space to determine who they are. So I know there's a lot of concern about the medications that puberty blockers. And puberty blockers are reversible. What puberty blockers do is they allow a person who identifies as trans to hit pause on puberty. And they can unpause at any time they want. But if they hit pause, it just gives them the space to continue to discern who they are, so that they don't find themselves, again, wedged into a box that eventually becomes smothering for them.
Yeah. We talked earlier about the fact that the United Church of Christ has had its rainbow banners and signs of acceptance and welcome, that we're a welcoming church. And there are some Methodist churches now, as the denomination goes through this hard discussion about the theology of these sexual issues. Some are proclaiming themselves to be welcoming congregations. But let's just put ourselves we have a couple of minutes left, put ourselves in a more conservative church that's very troubled by these turns of events and these changes in the theological understanding of our sexuality. Is there not still a place to move from judgment and still welcome people in, even if you can't accept them in their activity?
Yes, well, I think that for Scripture tells us that we are made in God's image. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but it says man and woman, God created in God's image. It doesn't say man or woman. And instead, we have a sense, I have a sense, that the full spectrum of humanity is made in God's image. If God made us, we are made in God's image. And that means that God's image is far broader than each individual person.
Yeah.
We are someplace on that spectrum, each of us. But we don't necessarily get to dictate to God who bestows that upon us. And my sense of what that means is we're co-creators with God, of the world God gave us, of the garden God wanted us to till and protect. And we can create a better and more just society that is more welcoming, even when our theology gives us questions.
Yeah, yeah. The assumption is that our viewers, listeners are people of faith. Otherwise, they'd be watching a fishing show or something.
That's right.
And so if you're interested in what your own faith community or denomination has decided or is working through, you go to your denomination's website and look for the social action or other places where you can find out what your denomination's official position is, and then you can measure that with your own faith community or your own church's acceptance or welcome. So our guest today has been the Reverend Pat Raube, who is the pastor at the Union Presbyterian Church at 200 East Main Street in Endicott.
That's
Big
right.
stone church there.
Yes.
And we've been talking about LGBTQIA+.
That's right.
All of these different letters,
That's right.
because we're going to see them in news stories, and we're going to see them in our church publications, and the church is going to continue to wrestle with our theological and biblical and social understandings, as well as the science, the biology, as we've talked about,
Yes.
of all the questions. Basically, if we're talking about the children of our church, or we're talking about adults in our church who are struggling, let's give them an open heart.
Yes.
I'm Jeff Kellam, thanking you for being with us on the Encounter program produced by the Broome County Council of Churches. Our thanks to WBNG TV for the studio and for the production facilities, and our thanks to the Town Square media stations for airing the audio portion of our program. Again, Jeff Kellam, hoping that in the coming week you'll be gentle with people, he points the finger, and end with yourself.